Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Strait of strain. President Trump says the U.S. has destroyed 10 inactive mine-laying vessels amid reports Iran is placing explosives throughout the Strait of Hormuz. Trump warns the U.S. will hit back at a level never seen before if those reports are true.
And Wright prompts whiplash. A now deleted claim from the U.S. Energy Secretary jolting markets today. Chris Wright declaring the U.S. had escorted a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Moments later, the post was gone. Iran disputed it. And the White House confirming there was no U.S. escort. Oil paring losses, equities turning lower on the reversal. What it means for crude credibility and the U.S. posture in the region. All ahead.
And all eyes on Georgia. A special election is underway in Georgia to replace former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. More than a dozen candidates are running in this solidly Republican district, making it an early test of the political mood. We'll speak with Democratic candidate Shawn Harris later this hour.
We begin with breaking news this evening. There are multiple reports that Iran is taking steps now to deploy mines in the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump responding just moments ago, saying if these reports are true, quote, the military consequences to Iran will be at a level never seen before, unquote. We get right to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is live at the White House now, joining us from the North Lawn. Kate, the president posting again to say that within the last few hours, we have hit and completely destroyed 10 inactive mine-laying boats and or ships with more to follow. So this has begun.
That's right. So the president and this White House are very focused on the Strait of Hormuz right now. So ships going through the strait, as you know, Joe, carry around 1/5 of the global oil supply. And basically all trade through the strait has stopped since the start of the war in Iran due to security concerns. Now we're seeing reports from CNN and other outlets that Iran is indeed laying mines in the strait. The president posting a couple times on social media about this, first saying that if these reports are true, Iran needs to immediately remove those mines or there will be severe consequences, and then followed up in a second post saying that the U.S. had already taken out 10 inactive mine-laying ships. This is coming, of course, as there is a lot of volatility and concern in the oil markets. I also wanted to highlight that post that you talked about from Chris Wright. So Chris Wright posted on X that the U.S. Navy had escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Caroline Leavitt, that post was not up for that long. It was then deleted. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was asked about this in a briefing today. She said the U.S. has not the U.S. Navy has not escorted a tanker through the strait. Not that it will not happen, but that has not happened so far.
Well, and of course, we're on watch to see if and when it does and how many service members might be involved in that effort. Kate, knowing we did get an update today, or at least the White House, Caroline Leavitt specifically, confirming reports that more than 100 soldiers, aside from the 8 who have lost their lives, have been injured in this conflict so far.
That's right. So we actually now have numbers from the Pentagon. We have an update saying that 140 service members have been injured in this war. 8 of them have been severely injured. And of course, the 7 American troops have died in the war. The president was at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware over the weekend on Saturday and witnessed the first 6 bodies of the American troops that have been killed in Iran return home.
Kate, we haven't seen President Trump today. Does he have any public events in the next 24 hours? We had the news conference, of course, from Miami that we carried, but there's still been no formal address to the American people. Is anything scheduled?
That's right. So the president is scheduled to travel to Cincinnati and Kentucky. He's going to talk about the economy. But as of today, we're not expected, or there's nothing on the schedule, I should say. Things can, of course, change very quickly, but not today.
Absolutely.
And don't we know it? Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan reporting live from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, as Kate was speaking to, due to the unpredictability and back and forth on Twitter, or the post and then deleted by Chris Wright, it was another day of volatility for both oil and stocks. And for the details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who is joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. And Romaine, talk about whiplash.
Yeah, another day of stunning moves in the oil market. This time, of course, coming on the back of those conflicting messages coming out of the Trump administration as to what exactly is going on in the Strait of Hormuz. What we do know to be fact is that 11 days in, the Strait of Hormuz Hormuz is still at a standstill. We spoke up with Mandy Zhu a little bit earlier on Bloomberg Television, who heads derivatives over at Cboe, and she made a really great point that right now traders in this market, in the oil market, are anticipating not only higher oil prices, but higher oil prices for longer. And that's her read through with regards to what's going on in the options market. You take a look at options going out to late May. Most of the strike prices that people are trading around are around the $105 to $110 level for call spreads. Some of those even go further out into June. So effectively what that means in layman's term is you have a lot of folks in this market that are betting that crude oil, Brent crude oil, will likely stay near $100 a barrel at least through the end of May and potentially longer. And that could potentially be bad news for stocks and, more importantly, for the economy.
Boy, that's for sure, Romaine. I want to ask you about some better news here after the bell from the likes of Oracle, which has really been the poster child of worries about the AI spend. The reaction here, not bad, and what some analysts are calling a clean beat.
Yeah, it was a clean beat in their fiscal third quarter. You see the shares up about 8%, Joe. They also guided for the current quarter, basically saying that for the full year, this is their fiscal year closing out in a few weeks, this idea that they are going to hit that $90 billion revenue target. But the real key here is what they're going to spend on CapEx for the next fiscal year. They said for this current fiscal year, they plan to hit that $50 billion target, which is what they've guided for. However, Joe, what they did not say in that press release was what they plan to spend for next year. And the conference call has just kicked off, and that is what everybody wants to know. Are they going to continue spending at that big clip that they had been spending for the last couple of years? And if so, will that annoy investors, encourage investors? Well, we could find out in a few minutes, Joe.
All right, Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick will stay tuned for the call as we turn now to Capitol Hill, where Republican leaders are demanding the restoration of DHS as senators received a classified Iran briefing on Capitol Hill. Democrats responding to the latest action between the U.S. and Iran. Take a listen.
It is solely the responsibility of the United States Congress to declare war. Make no mistake, this is Trump's war. He says it every day. They can couch it however they want. If he wants to go any further, he needs to come out and have this discussion with Congress and the American people.
At this point, I am a hard no on a supplemental. This is not a war the American people want us to engage in. This is not a war supported by this country, and this is not a war that makes us safer.
Joining us now with her reaction to all of this, Republican Congresswoman Erin Houchin of Indiana, who was in the room during President Trump's speech last evening. We brought you the news conference that followed, coming to us from the aforementioned Republican retreat in Florida. She serves on both the House Budget Committee and House Energy Committee. It's great to see you, Congresswoman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd love your thoughts on what's about to happen on Capitol Hill, but I do want to ask you first, as a member of the Energy Committee, about this report today that we saw on Twitter that was deleted shortly thereafter from the Energy Secretary, suggesting that indeed a vessel, he said at the time 36 hours earlier, had passed through the strait. I realize that's different than saying it received a U.S. escort. Can you confirm that a vessel did actually make it through? And do we know what that was all about?
I haven't seen the news on that, so I can't comment on whether that is true or not. I can tell you that President Trump delivered remarks last night, expressing his desire to continue the efforts in Iran to make sure that they are never able to obtain a nuclear weapon. That is in the best interest of the American people. You mentioned, the work we're going to be doing on Capitol Hill. We're continuing to ask our Democrat counterparts to fund DHS while our military is engaging in these operations. It's unconscionable that we would have the Democrats holding DHS funding to protect essentially illegal immigrants here, many of those violent criminal illegal immigrants from deportation.
Just to follow up quickly, Congresswoman, before we get into some of the other domestic issues, do you support the president's plan? And do you know anything further about this idea to provide military escorts to oil tankers moving their way through the strait?
Well, it's clear. I certainly support the president. It's clear that we have to continue the movement of oil through that region. Iran is backed. Their backs are against the wall. This is a movement of desperation by them to place that under threat and to continue to push back when we know that a nuclear Iran is a danger to everyone, not just Americans, but everyone around the world. President Trump acted in the best interest of what we believe was imminent threats from Iran for the safety of the American people. So it makes a few things highlighted that we have to keep the pressure on Iran, whatever it takes to get movement from of these oil shipments. But it also places an emphasis on the importance of having an America First energy agenda so that we are energy independent. We don't have to rely on countries that are not our friends to supply the oil of the world.
Well, when we think about energy, though, Congresswoman, we saw a move in the oil market on that, I guess, errant or erroneous post from the Energy Secretary saying this naval escort has occurred. Given the vulnerability, the sensitivity markets have proven to have around this conflict, how that directly translates to gas prices that American consumers are seeing, does the administration not need to be more careful here?
Well, I think what we saw under the Biden administration certainly was high gas prices.
I'm asking about the Trump administration, Congresswoman.
Those have started to come down under the Trump administration. And anytime there's conflict in the Middle East, we're going to see this, which is why President Trump has placed an emphasis and House Republicans have placed an emphasis on our own energy independence. And we will continue to do that. This cannot continue, and I hope that the president's actions will move swiftly, as Caroline Leavitt said today, and firmly to make sure that oil keeps moving through the strait.
Well, when we consider those actions, Congressman, we heard from Democratic senators as they emerged from a briefing on Capitol Hill with senior members of the administration today about Iran, the idea that perhaps ground troops are in the future. This is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. Just take a listen, if you will.
I emerged from this briefing as dissatisfied and angry, frankly, as I have from any past briefing in my 15 years in the Senate. We seem to be on a path toward deploying American troops on the ground in Iran.
Is that also the impression you have, Congresswoman, from the briefings you have received? And do you think that is something that actually would require congressional approval?
Yeah, the briefings that I have been in, I've been in one classified briefing. I can't speak to the conversations, but I can say that it was a comprehensive briefing that laid out the case for why this action was necessary. And we've heard even from some of our Democrat counterparts who do agree with us that the threat of nuclear warfare from Iran was real to the United States, and that we have successfully beaten that back for the first time in 47 years. I would point to the Democrats not funding the Department of Homeland Security at a time when our military is engaged in this conflict in Iran, again, at the benefit of criminal illegal aliens, protecting them from deportation, and not funding a DHS, which is resulting in 100,000 TSA, Coast Guard, and DHS employees, including FEMA, after we've just seen a natural disaster in the states of Oklahoma and Michigan from receiving their paychecks. I hope that they will swiftly go back to Washington and fund DHS. But as far as conversations about what are those classified briefings have entailed, I have been satisfied with the briefings I've received.
I wonder if the Energy Committee and your colleagues anticipate more volatility in the oil market to the extent that you can warn our viewers and listeners, Congresswoman, because yesterday at the retreat that we wanted to talk to you about at Doral, Lisa McGlone, who chairs the Republican conference, said we're fighting a little tradition. Of course, with seasonality working against Republicans in this midterm cycle. Can you fight tradition when you've got gas prices above $3.50 a gallon?
Well, we are always working on bringing gas prices down, even when we have, conflicts that result in oil prices going up. We've seen this before. Mm-hmm. House Republicans are working on this on multiple fronts, though, not just for gas prices, but for the price of groceries and inflation coming down, wage growth increasing. We're seeing positive signs on other places in the economy, but it will take a while to dig out from the high rates of inflation that we saw under President Biden. And this conflict, unfortunately, will result in a temporary spike in gas prices. I hope we'll quickly regain movement in the Strait and get those oil prices coming back down.
And Congresswoman, finally, given your seat on the Budget Committee, we've heard that there's been talk in Florida of another budget package, budget reconciliation package, perhaps. At least that's what the chair, Jody Arrington, is pushing. Is that also your anticipation, and under what timeline?
Those conversations are still ongoing about whether we will or won't have another reconciliation package. There's many ideas being floated here at the retreat that aren't yet set in stone, so I wouldn't want to comment prematurely on whether that plan is moving forward or what would be included.
All right, Republican Congresswoman Erin Houchin of Indiana, thank you for joining us here on Bloomberg. And coming up, new polling shows less than a third of Americans approve of the strikes against Iran. We'll have more on how public opinion around the conflict could shape the midterm elections when Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated.
Are you thinking this week it will be over?
No,
Are you talking
but soon.
about days?
I think soon.
Okay, and with respect
Very soon. Look, everything they have is gone, including their leadership.
As President Trump declared yesterday, we're crushing the enemy in an overwhelming display of technical skill and military force. We will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. That was President Trump. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth answering questions on the expected timeline for the war in Iran. The president saying soon. Meanwhile, new polling out shows Americans not fully on board with this conflict, with only 29% approving, 43% disapproving, and 26% saying they are unsure. Similar numbers that we saw at the start of the conflict. Joining us now here in our Washington bureau with her reaction, Nia-Malika Henderson, Bloomberg opinion columnist. It's always great to spend some time, Nia. We just talked for a few minutes with a member of the Republican House Conference. They're down in Miami at their retreat, trying to talk about how to message things like affordability when we're wrestling with the timeline over a new conflict in Iran. The president has obviously said a lot of things over the past 24 hours, and the markets have been a bit spooked by the confusion. How about voters?
Well, listen, I think voters have a lot of questions, right, about the why of this war, the timing of this war, how long it will last. And remember, this is a public who sent Donald Trump to the White House in 2016 and in 2024 because he was a critic of forever wars. He complained about the ways in which blood and treasure was lost in the Middle East. So it's a bit of a surprise, I think, to a lot of Americans that here we are, and a lot of the rhetoric sounds so familiar to everything we covered in the past decade or so in the Middle East. Like, they're arming the Kurds now. Oh, where have I heard that before? And so I think that's how Americans are reacting to this. And you see from that polling that there's not a lot of support, right? There's 29% that are supportive or approving of this, and then this 26%, right, that are unsure. What you really find historically in wars is that they don't get more popular, right? The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, those were a reaction, obviously, to 9/11, and they were somewhat popular, right? There was a rallying effect of Americans, and you're not seeing that with this. And I think the White House is in this position of trying to get some of that rallying effect. You have Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, or Secretary of the Defense Department, whatever you want to call it, out there, sort of beating his chest about the might of the American military. But to a lot of Americans, they're like, well, what about America first, right? That was why they sent Donald Trump to the White House. And to see this is, I think, a distraction from what Americans thought he would do. And when they're now wrestling with these higher gasoline prices.
Well, and when you look at the Ipsos polling, the majority of those polled suggested they are worried about the costs here at home. In terms of the economic costs, they are worried also about the actual cost of funding this military operation and the cost of American service members' lives. And I wonder, Nia, what pressure you think is the greatest?
Listen, I think all of the above, but I mean, as you've seen from this president, he hasn't really responded to those pressures, right?
He said he doesn't care about
he doesn't really care. He was asked about, for instance, the increased price of gasoline, the pain at the pump that Americans are increasingly feeling, and he said something like, if it goes up, it goes up, but at some point it'll go down. But listen, if you are putting together your monthly budget and you've got to pay for gasoline and you've got to pay for other energy costs and daycare, whatever you have to pay for, you know, that is cold comfort that at some point in the future, gasoline and energy prices might go down.
We've talked a lot about the split within MAGA over this whole idea, and even a split within the administration to the extent that you're writing in your column today. Vance flip-flops his way out of favor. I can only imagine your inbox, Nia-Malika Henderson.
I just delete them.
I someday give me a lesson. J.D. Vance, you say, has changed his stance on various issues, including going to war with Iran, which we all remember. This was a highlight of the campaign. He said it would be a huge distraction of resources and massively expensive. The latter's certainly true.
Yeah.
How's he morphing into a supporter of Donald Trump on this issue?
Well, listen, he is now selling the war, trying to sell this the war as something that America had to do, as a sort of a preemptive strike because Iran was going to strike America and the destruction of the nuclear facilities. And in so many ways, this is classic J.D. Vance. He has been a shapeshifter throughout his political ascent, which has been quite rapid, right? You think, you know, I know J.D. Vance from CNN, where he was a commentator, and I used to see him in the green room. And that's when he was a real critic of Donald Trump. This was when he was in sort of Donald Trump is Hitler. That was the phase he was in at that point. And he's very different now, obviously, trying to succeed Donald Trump as president. He will, of course, run in 2028. He's held in high regard among lots of Republicans. I question how highly, how high in regard Donald Trump holds him. I think Marco Rubio, he holds in a little bit more higher regard, because I think Marco Rubio just sort of, he's a bit more of a weighty figure. He has a bit more gravitas, I think, and more charisma, and doesn't seem to be as much of a flip-flopper, shapeshifter, and a bit of a phony. And I think that's something that Donald Trump is very aware of.
Well, and when we consider Marco Rubio, who, of course, has been one of the faces of this conflict with Iran, but also Venezuela. He is talking a big game about Cuba as well. Is this just the Rubio star continuing to rise?
That's exactly right. He has a real portfolio, and it's the portfolio that Donald Trump himself prizes much more so than anything that he's doing domestically, right? He's not spending much time on affordability or the economy. He really is thinking that he can make his mark as sort of a world leader and a historical figure by doing these massive moves in these different countries.
Pretty amazing. You know, Hillbilly Elegy was a question on Jeopardy last night. I'll just,
and you got it right?
leave that right here. With that said, we've come a long way from the writings of that book. Does that come back to bite J.D. Vance in 2028 if he is, in fact, a front runner?
I think it does. I mean, I think just the question of who he is, right, will come up because he's been on different sides of so many issues. And I think people are going to look for, you know, sort of a true believer. And listen, I think it's going to matter who Donald Trump endorses. And he's been asking folks, he's down in Florida asking big donors, who do you like? Marco or J.D. Vance for 2028. And he's talked about them as sort of an unstoppable team, but the question of who's on top has always been an open one, and it feels like at this point the wind is moving in Marco Rubio's direction.
Of course, it still is only 2026.
That's right.
We have a long way to go. Nia-Malika Henderson, Bloomberg opinion columnist, thank you so much. And coming up, strategists say a sustained spike in oil could overshadow Americans' tax savings from the One Big Beautiful Bill. We'll have more on what's happening to oil prices next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As President Trump declared yesterday, we're crushing the enemy in an overwhelming display of technical skill and military force. We will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we heard from the Defense Secretary earlier today, Pete Hegseth, speaking there during a Pentagon briefing this morning, saying the U.S. will not end the war with Iran until the enemy has been defeated. But what does that actually look like in practice? Joining us now with her insights, Becca Wasser, who leads our defense coverage at Bloomberg Economics. Becca, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. We understand today from that briefing, the Pentagon announcing this would be the most intense day of strikes yet against Iran. A week ago, we were asking about munitions and stockpiles. What does this mean for our weaponry and our posture in the theater?
Well, the United States has sufficient offensive munitions at this juncture in time, but I think we're starting to see a shift in how they are approaching strikes. We've heard from press briefing to press briefing that they are trying to shift from some of these longer range standoff weapons to using some of the closer in stand-in weapons, these joint direct attack munitions. And part of this is because some of those longer range weapons are more limited in supply. They take much longer to produce, and they are incredibly expensive. Additionally, they are these advanced capabilities that would be needed in a potential conflict against a peer adversary or a more advanced military than what Iran is. So to try and conserve those weapons, we are starting to see a shift in how the United States is trying to approach the continued strikes that they are doing on a variety of targets in Iran. But that requires them to get air superiority and to ensure that they can actually operate without additional risks to U.S. forces.
Well, Becca, as we talk about a variety of targets, let's talk about some of the latest targets. We understand President Trump saying on Truth Social that within the last few hours, the U.S. has destroyed 10 inactive mine-laying boats or ships. This after, of course, of reports that Iran was beginning to lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Just give us a sense of what Iran's mine capacity actually is, and knowing that the administration has been heralding the fact that we've eliminated so many of their naval vessels. Does that necessarily mean that they don't have the capabilities to place these mines anymore?
So according to the U.S. government, the last time that they released any type of official numbers about Iran's capabilities was in 2019. But then they said that they had about 5,000 mines or so. You could imagine that throughout the years, they've managed to acquire more, if not produce more. Additionally, Iran doesn't need fancy, large warships in order to mine the strait. It's something that it can do with much smaller ships, even some, drone boats or even submersibles. We've seen in the past that Iran has been able to use mines of various sorts. Historically, they've laid mines during the tanker wars of the 1980s. We've also seen them use limpet mines more recently in the Gulf in 2019, 2020. So Iran has a variety of options for what it could do, and it doesn't necessarily require them to have advanced capability.
Becca, let's get back to the central question that we started with here. What does victory actually look like? What does an enemy defeated actually look like? Do we simply call that an open Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think the United States has said that it's really important to keep the Strait of Hormuz open for various reasons, and they're quite obvious. It's really about the economics and ensuring the free flow of energy supplies throughout the world and the importance of the strait for that. But in terms of what does a victory look like, what does objectives actually look like? Sure, it's keeping the strait open, but I think there's a bigger question at play, which is what does victory look like in this conflict overall? And thus far, there's been a conflation of these tactical and operational successes with strategic success. And until there's clarification on exactly what those operational missions are and how they network to a broader strategic, if not political objective, it's going to be very hard to say what is victory other than perhaps maybe a tweet from the president declaring victory, as we've seen him do in the past.
All right, Becca Wasser, defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. Always great analysis and insight. Thank you so much. And joining us now from our Miami bureau with his insight into how oil markets are responding to all of this is Mike McGlone, senior commodity strategist with Bloomberg Intelligence. Mike, obviously it is no secret we have seen immense volatility in the oil space. One headline from Trump, one headline from the energy secretary, even if it went away quickly, is enough to move markets pretty significantly. What signal should we take from that? That it seems that they are ready to move so dramatically on just one thing that is said by one member of the administration. What does that say about where positioning is?
Well, the volatility, I think, Kayleigh, is very significant to go the curve. It's very rare to have such extreme volatility in energy and precious metals without it trickling down to the stock market. And you're seeing that maybe start to begin. So if the stock market goes down, everything is going to go down. But the bottom line for crude oil put in a pretty significant peak this week at 120. It's down at $83 or so a barrel. That's on a year up about 26%, not a big deal. But natural gas did the same thing. It was up 100% in January. Now it's down 20% in the year. That's potentially the path we're going to follow in crude oil. And the key reason is there's a glut of supply in North America. And what this price pump did is it's going to accelerate that glut of supply. And unless there's an enduring cut of supply from the Middle East, which I think is very unlikely, it's going to trickle over lower. And the bottom line is, what does Mr. Trump want by the midterms? Remember, right now is March. Yeah. I look at that contracts that's going to be front month by the time, the futures contract front month by the time we get to the election, and they're much lower. For instance, the February contract is at $67 a barrel. That'll be the front month contract at the end of the year. And I think it's going to go down below 57 because 57 is unchanged in a year, means up on the year and then back down. That's what natural gas has already done.
57. We'll make a note of that, Mike. So you're seeing across the valley like the market is at the moment. As far as the immediate term goes, did we learn today how important it is to have military escorts for these tankers in the Strait?
I think that's part of it, Joe. The key theme is the Strait is still closed. Now, that's a major military faux pas. I did not expect that, but we've already priced that in. I think we're going to look back from the future and say, yeah, okay, they closed the Strait. Prices got to $120 a barrel, and just like every other peak in the past, then they collapse. You need some kind of sustained demand pull or supply constraint. Otherwise, crude oil does what it always does. And remember, the price right now you see on the screen was first traded in 2008.
Wow.
Well, yeah, that's pretty incredible. So, Mike, finally, when we consider the kind of short, medium, and long term here, knowing we're looking ahead to an election in November, where could we go in the interim between now and then, and where do you think we end up by the time the midterms roll around?
Here's one for you, Kayleigh. $40 a barrel. Now, I've been saying that since 2022. That's been the low price cure 3 times since 2008. And every single time it gets to that level, it resets those excesses of supply and demand, which we have now, and then resets and goes higher. I think that's possible by the end of the year, particularly under one key theme. It's stock market volatility near an 8-year low, 180-day volatility just picks up a little bit. Everything's trending that way. The key thing is, like I wanted to point out, is natural gas has already collapsed. That big spike in gold tells us a problem. And the bottom line, I think, looking forward now is Mr. Trump is the leader of the world's largest energy producer, net exporter, and he wants lower prices, and he's got pre-existing trends in his favor. I think for the end of the year, he's going to get them.
All right, Mike McGlone, Senior Commodity Strategist with Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much. And of course, gas and oil prices, whether they're at $40 or $140, could have an impact when voters head to the polls for the midterms in November. But in Georgia, the polls are open today, at least in the 14th Congressional District, for a special election to replace Marjorie Taylor Greene following her decision to step down midway into her latest term in the House. And joining us now is a Democratic candidate in this jungle primary, retired Brigadier General Shawn Harris. Shawn, thanks for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We should note you also ran against Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2024. She won by nearly 30 points. Other than her no longer being a factor in this particular election, what dynamics have changed on the ground in the district that make you think you have a better chance this time around?
Hey, Katie, I would tell you everything has changed. You know, the first time I ran against Marjorie, you're right. We didn't win the election, but guess what? 135,000 people actually voted for me. That's the most that any Democrat has ever received. And then when Marjorie decided to step down with her divorce with Donald Trump, then now I'm running against 13, 14 other Republicans. None of those Republicans have ever ran for Congress. My name is the name that people know and trust here in the district. And that's why we're actually going to win this thing tonight. And if we don't win it tonight, we're going to win the runoff, because I'm getting Democrats, independents, and yes, Republicans are voting for me.
General, it's great to have you with us on Bloomberg. We should note, for the sake of our audience, after 9/11, you were deployed as an infantry commander in Afghanistan. and you have seen combat. And I wonder what this moment means for you, as Georgia is, of course, teeming with active duty and veterans of the military. Many of them support Donald Trump. How are you telegraphing this decision to enter this war with Iran when you talk to voters?
Yeah, you know, Joe, and that's an awesome question, because here inside the district, 40,000 veterans in our district. And then, as you're right, we have military bases all over Georgia right now. Where I talk to veterans is, hey, I am a veteran. I'm going to look out for you. I'm going to make sure that you receive your benefits. But on top of that, because I've spent time in combat and led people in combat, the reality of it is this, like your earlier conversation that you had, it's two things going on at the same time. I used to be part of CENTCOM. My last assignment was Israel as a senior defense official. I am confident that the military side of this coin is going to do an outstanding job and win decisively. However, because the President of the United States has never came before the American people and told us why we're in this fight, tell us why we're doing it, and what's in our national interest. But on top of that, he's never explained to us, how do we define winning and how do we get out of it? Because of all those things, we can win the war on the military side of the house, but we can actually fail or be defeated on the political side of the house. And that's why it's so important for me to go to D.C. so that I can help hold Donald Trump and others responsible, because right now Congress is not doing their job when you saw what we did at the war powers, because we need to make sure that the American people understand why do we have our sons and daughters in a war right now.
Well, Shawn, if you do end up with a seat in Congress later this year, it's entirely possible that you will be on the receiving end of a supplemental funding request from the administration, if not directly to fund the operations in Iran, potentially to refund the replenishing of our munitions and stockpiles that were used in this conflict. Is that something you would be supportive of? Do you believe that the Democratic Party should support supplemental funding, even if they were not necessarily in support of these combat operations?
I would say point blank, I believe that we need to make sure that our military is prepared to protect us no matter where it happens around the world. But in addition to that, I would demand that the leadership from the Donald Trump administration come in, brief us in an open setting. We can talk about a lot of things on the top secret side. That's fine. But I want to make sure the American people clearly can hear for themselves. The people here in Northwest Georgia can hear for themselves. So when I vote, whatever way I vote, they can understand it and say, I understand why Shawn Harris voted for this, because it was in the best interest of the people here in Northwest Georgia. As y'all guys know, in rural communities, a lot of our sons and daughters go into the military. And I want to make sure that I do everything to protect them.
Well, we appreciate that, and thank you for your service, General. Just lastly, you could also face a vote on refunding the Department of Homeland Security, knowing that there is likely an increased threat of domestic terror. That's what we hear since this conflict with Iran began. Would you vote yes on that bill today, or would you need to see demasking for ICE agents, if not judicial warrants?
Yes, it's a lot of things that need to happen in Homeland Security. The good thing is we just fired somebody, and that's yesterday's news. The reality of it is we need to see if the new leadership's going to come in, what is he actually going to focus on? But you're exactly right. ICE needs to be treated just like the rest of the police that's running around the United States. They need to follow the rules. They need to treat people with respect. And I plan to get to D.C. and hold them accountable for that. But I also want to be clear. Because we're in a war of choice with Iran, I'm fully confident that it is people running around the United States that want to hurt us very badly. So I want to make sure that they can do their job. But before we get to that point, we need to make sure that the leadership of Homeland Security is actually going to do theirs.
Well, we appreciate your insights on what I know is a pretty busy day. Retired Brigadier General Shawn Harris, we thank you. We should note our team did extend an invitation to the Republican frontrunner in this race, Clay Fuller. We have not heard back, and we'll keep tabs on results for you in this primary. Coming up, how Congress is watching this action unfold in the Middle East and how it is shaping their midterm messaging. We'll discuss with our political panel coming up next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We'll have much more on today's top stories when our political panel joins us up ahead. But first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Canadian police are investigating a national security incident after shots were fired at the U.S. consulate in Toronto early this morning. According to witness accounts, two men got out of a white Honda CR-V and shots were fired from what appeared to be a handgun. No injuries were reported, and the police do not believe that there is any ongoing threat to public safety.
The Senate Subcommittee on the Constitution held a hearing today on the subject of birthright citizenship. This ahead of the April 1st Supreme Court case that challenges President Trump's executive order denying citizenship to the children of illegal immigrants and temporary visitors. The debate centered on the issue of birth tourism and whether or not the 14th Amendment could be interpreted to exclude the children of non-citizens. Witnesses included legal professionals, the president of the Government Accountability Institute, and a veteran who became a citizen through the 14th Amendment.
And moments ago on Capitol Hill, Republican Senator Thom Tillis reiterated he will block Kevin Warsh's confirmation as Federal Reserve Chair, even after a, quote, good meeting between the two. Warsh and Tillis met today as Trump's pick begins a round of meetings on Capitol Hill. The senator, of course, is bound to block any Fed nominations moving through the Senate Banking Committee until the Department of Justice finishes its investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell over his testimony to the panel last year on renovations to the Fed's offices. And joining us now with their reaction to these stories and more is this evening's political panel. Megan Hayes, Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Ashley Davis, partner at S3 Group. Welcome to you both. It's great to have you. Obviously, there has been a lot going on today, most of the conversation dominated by the ongoing conflict in Iran. Ashley, when Joe and I were on earlier this afternoon, we saw within minutes a post from the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, that the U.S. Navy had escorted a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz, only for it to be deleted minutes later in the White House to later confirm that that never happened. What does that say to you about the tightness of messaging coming from the administration around this conflict?
And I also saw, by the way, that there were many ships that were attacked today in the Strait, which I don't think that ever came true as well. But I think Susie Wiles has done such a great job in regards to communication for this administration to this point. I think that this is something that she needs to make sure to get all the cabinet secretaries, because obviously every time someone says something, it moves the markets, as you guys know more than anything, which is why I think the president was very measured with his response yesterday. But I'm assuming that everyone got pulled in and that one message is going out, because whether that happened or not, and I don't think anyone knows if that really happened today or not.
The White House says it did not.
So I think, yes, but I mean, I think that there's going to be a tighter communication, or I hope so.
There may well have been a vessel that passed through the strait.
Maybe it was an escort. And by the way, I do think that supposedly other countries in the EU are starting to give their ships and Navy ships to help with this problem. I mean, hopefully.
I can only imagine. This could have been the Greek tanker that we heard make its way through the midnight run through the Strait of Hormuz. That'll be a whole movie on its own. But you did communications for the last administration, Megan, and you know how this stuff works. What does it mean when an agency is told to delete a post when the boss doesn't like what's up there?
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
It's also a big problem because people don't trust the administration and what's coming out of the administration in general. And so you don't know what to believe. Are they right, or is now the White House correct? And that's a problem. And we are at war, and there are going to be American troops on the ground here soon. That's like the way we are going. And it's a problem when no one knows who to believe and if we know if it happened or didn't happen. And it is going to move markets, and it is going to cause international incidents. And when you do communications in the White House, there are a few things you think about. Is anyone going to lose their life? Are you going to cause an international incident? Are you going to move markets? Those are really important things to factor in while you're doing communications, and the fact that they can't get it right is a huge problem.
I do think, though, I keep saying this, I do think that the boots on the ground, because I think it's gotten, because of the messaging, has gotten a little blown up. I think from what I've been told and from what I understand, it's going to be it's probably going to be CIA, probably some like Navy SEALs, like that types of special forces, those types of boots on the ground, not that we're doing what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan.
But we are still putting American lives at risk and do not have competent leadership or competent communications out to the American people of what's going on, and that's a problem.
What does it tell us then when the White House is asked today about the number of wounded? There was a report that it was 120. Turns out it was more like 140 based on the official number here. And the press secretary acknowledged it and said something in that ballpark. Isn't that the type of thing that the White House should be bringing directly to the American people?
Well, first of all, any loss of life for our military or an American in general is horrid and horrific. And I think that we should thank our military first for protecting us, and especially against, I mean, no matter what you believe or how this was handled, Iran is like not a good place.
That's right.
And so I think we need to remember that. I do think as well that those 140, which, yes, you have to get the numbers right, going back to your original point, but I think many of them were not seriously wounded, but at the end of the day, 7 people have died, and that's kind of the messaging that I think. But I don't know if someone broke 2 arms, if that's something we need to message. I think we need to message like serious casualties and obviously serious people that are seriously hurt.
Well, and of course, it's not just a consideration of U.S. lives lost, but there have been thousands of people killed in Iran, including more than 100 elementary schoolers, as the president contends that it might have been an Iranian Tomahawk that hit that school, even though the Defense Department hasn't said that. He says he's waiting for the outcome of the investigation. We heard from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt that he will accept whatever that outcome is. But I wonder if you can speak to, Megan, how that also impacts, especially as Iran's talking about, or as Trump is talking about the Iranian people needing to rise up here and seize this moment. Are we doing ourselves any favors in Iran domestically, or can that be kind of a rally around the flag effect?
Look, I think when you send mixed messages of why you're going into a country and you said you're going to be involved in a regime change, when you literally just put the person's son in, so now you used to have an 80-something-year-old horrible dictator, and now you have a 56-year-old horrible dictator that also hates America, that's not a good message for the Iranian people to want to rise up and to fight back against their own regime. They don't have a lot of faith in that. But I do think you do have these instances that are terrible and awful when we are at war and military happens, but we need to take ownership for it. We're the United States of America. We need to show leadership, and you have to take ownership for it. And the president knows darn well that that was our Tomahawk, being that there are not that many countries that have the ability to have Tomahawks in the region right now.
There aren't many at all. So if one were to course correct and they called Ashley at S3 Group to talk about it, how about a formal address? I hate to sound old-fashioned. I keep asking about this. An address from the Resolute desk in the Oval Office with everything that we know tonight to the American people. Is that forthcoming, or should it be?
Probably. I do, and I'm trying to measure my response. I do think that also that what he's trying to do right now, if I can read the tea leaves, and believe me, I'm not in his brain, but however, I think that he's trying to stabilize the region, but also not tell Iran what he's doing. I mean, obviously today we heard Hegseth say that it's going to be the worst attacks yet, and I haven't seen that yet, but listen, we also are coordinating this with Israel, and I think that Israel is not going to ever give up, and we need to make sure, though, that we do have an end game, because otherwise this could be something like, we don't want this to be Iraq. Obviously, it's 10 days in. Yesterday we were debating if it's how many days, because we're like so confused. But I mean, it's still something that the American people do not care about as a whole.
Care for or care about?
I don't think that the American people as a whole care about what's happening in Iran, because they're worried about their everyday lives. I mean, outside of our
They're wondering why we're spending $1 billion a day fighting in a country when they can't afford health care and groceries, and now gas is skyrocketing, and it's going to be it will take so long to get the gas prices back, and now all of a sudden you're going to see gas prices for jet fuel rise. All these different things are going to have an impact, and that's what the American people, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, but I also think that it's
a gallon. I wish we had time. We could do an hour here. Megan Hayes and Ashley Davis, we appreciate your thoughts as ever. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.